There's something quietly revolutionary about people who let their birthday pass without celebration. While the world around them lights candles and throws confetti, they simply continue. Another ordinary day. No cake, no party, no fanfare, just silence where others expect noise. And if you've ever been one of these people, or known someone who is, you've probably wondered what lies beneath that choice. Is it sadness, or is it something deeper? Because in a culture that practically worships birthdays, choosing not to celebrate feels almost rebellious. Like refusing a gift everyone insists you deserve. But here's what most people miss. For those who don't celebrate, it's rarely about rejection. It's about something far more complex. Something that speaks to how we understand time, identity, and meaning itself. See, birthdays are supposed to mark progress. They're cultural milestones that say you've made it another year, that you're moving forward, that you matter. But for some people, that narrative feels hollow. They look at their birthday and don't see achievement, they see randomness. The accident of being born on a particular date doesn't feel like something worth commemorating. It feels arbitrary. And there's a psychological term for this. It's called existential neutrality. People who don't celebrate birthdays often have a deeply internal relationship with time. They don't need external markers to tell them they're aging or growing. They feel it quietly, privately, without needing a day circled in red. For them, every day is both ordinary and significant. Growth doesn't happen once a year. It happens slowly, invisibly, in moments nobody sees. So why would one day deserve more attention than the others? But it goes deeper than philosophy. Sometimes the decision not to celebrate comes from a place of emotional self-protection. Birthdays carry expectations. They promise joy, connection, celebration, and when those promises aren't met, when the day feels lonelier than it should, the disappointment cuts deep. So some people stop celebrating, not because they don't want to, but because they've learned it hurts less to expect nothing. There's a concept in psychology called anticipated disappointment. It's when your brain, after repeated letdowns, starts protecting you by lowering expectations entirely. You stop hoping for the call, the message, the party. You stop waiting for people to remember. And eventually, you stop marking the day at all. Not because you don't matter, but because pretending you don't care feels safer than admitting you wanted something that didn't come. For others, it's not about pain, it's about overwhelm. Birthdays come with social obligations. You're supposed to be happy, grateful, excited. You're supposed to perform joy even if you don't feel it. And for people who value authenticity, that performance feels exhausting. They don't want to fake enthusiasm. They don't want to smile through a party they didn't ask for just to make others comfortable. So they opt out quietly. No drama, no explanation, just a polite decline and a preference for solitude. Because sometimes the kindest thing you can do for yourself is to stop pretending. There's also something deeply personal about how we relate to aging. For some, birthdays are reminders of time passing, of dreams not yet realized, of goals still out of reach. Each year becomes a deadline they didn't meet. And that's heavy. That's the weight of unfulfilled potential staring back at you in the form of a number. So they avoid the day entirely because confronting it means confronting everything they wish was different. Psychologists call this temporal anxiety, the stress that comes from measuring your life against time. And birthdays amplify it. They force you to ask the question nobody wants to answer. Am I where I thought I'd be? And if the answer is no, the day becomes painful. Not because of age itself, but because of the gap between expectation and reality. So some people choose not to look. They let the day pass unmarked, unacknowledged. But here's what's often misunderstood. Not celebrating doesn't mean not caring. It doesn't mean they don't value their existence. It often means they value it differently. They measure their worth in moments, not milestones. They find meaning in the everyday, in quiet mornings, in small kindnesses, in growth that doesn't need a stage. They don't need one day to feel special because they've learned to find significance in the unremarkable. And maybe that's a kind of wisdom, because when you stop tying your worth to specific dates, you start living more freely. You're not waiting for permission to celebrate yourself, you're just being yourself consistently, quietly. There's also a beautiful irony here. The people who don't celebrate birthdays often have the deepest understanding of what it means to truly live. They're not performing life, they're experiencing it. They don't need validation once a year to feel seen. They've learned to see themselves, and that's rare. That's the kind of self-awareness most people spend their whole lives chasing. Of course, there's another side to this. Some people avoid birthdays because of trauma. Maybe their birthday was always overshadowed by something painful, a loss, a breakup, a reminder of someone no longer there. So the day becomes haunted. It stops being about celebration and starts being about grief. And rather than relive that pain every year, they choose amnesia. They let the day dissolve into ordinariness. That's not avoidance. That's survival. It's protecting your heart from reopening wounds that haven't fully healed. And there's no shame in that. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is choose peace over tradition. Then there are the people who simply find birthdays uncomfortable because of the attention. They don't like being the center of focus. They don't want people singing to them or watching them blow out candles. It's not shyness exactly, it's more about control. They want to move through the world without being spotlighted. And birthdays take that away. They force you into visibility even if you prefer the shadows. So they skip it, not because they hate celebration, but because they hate performance. And in a world that constantly demands we perform happiness, choosing not to is an act of quiet rebellion. There's also something to be said about cultural conditioning. We're taught from childhood that birthdays are supposed to be the happiest day of the year. But what if they're not? What if you've never felt that magic? Then every birthday becomes a reminder that you're supposed to feel something you don't. And that dissonance, that gap between expectation and reality becomes exhausting, so you stop participating in the ritual altogether. You remove yourself from a game where the rules don't make sense to you. And that's okay. You don't owe anyone joy on command. You don't owe anyone a performance of gratitude just because the calendar says so. Here's what's fascinating. Many people who don't celebrate birthdays are incredibly thoughtful about celebrating others. They remember, they show up, they make people feel special. But when it comes to themselves, they withdraw. And that says something profound about how they see themselves versus others. They believe other people deserve celebration, but they struggle to extend that same grace inward. That's not indifference. That's often self-criticism wearing a mask. Psychologists call this the self-compassion gap, the tendency to treat others with more kindness than we treat ourselves. And birthdays expose that gap. They force the question of whether you believe you're worthy of being celebrated. And for many, the answer feels uncertain, so rather than confront it, they avoid the day entirely. It's easier to skip the question than to sit with the uncomfortable answer. But not everyone who skips birthdays is struggling. Some have simply outgrown the tradition. They've reached a point in life where external validation doesn't move them anymore. They know who they are. They've done the work of building a solid sense of self that doesn't need parties or presents to feel affirmed. And that's not coldness, that's maturity. That's the kind of self-possession most people admire but few achieve. There's also a spiritual dimension to this. Some people view birthdays as too ego-focused. They don't want to celebrate themselves when they believe life is about service, connection, and something larger than the individual. To them, making a day about yourself feels misaligned with their values. They'd rather spend the day giving than receiving. They'd rather let it pass quietly and focus on others instead. And that's not self-denial. That's a different way of finding meaning, a way that prioritizes collective well-being over individual recognition. And in a culture obsessed with the self, that feels almost countercultural. Here's the paradox. Birthdays are meant to make you feel valued, but for many people, they have the opposite effect. They highlight who didn't remember, who didn't call, who didn't care enough to show up. And that absence feels louder than any presence ever could. So over time, some people stop celebrating to avoid that ache. They stop setting themselves up for the disappointment of unmet expectations. They'd rather spend the day alone intentionally than surrounded by people who forgot. And maybe that's not sadness. Maybe that's just clarity, knowing what you can control and what you can't. The truth is, there's no single reason people don't celebrate birthdays. It's layered, it's personal, it's shaped by experiences, beliefs, wounds, and wisdom, and all of it is valid. Because at the end of the day, how you choose to mark your existence is entirely your own. You don't owe anyone a party. You don't owe anyone an explanation. You're allowed to honor your life in whatever way feels true. And for some, that means quietly, that means privately, that means without fanfare or fuss. Just another day, just another year, just another breath. And maybe that's enough. Maybe the people who don't celebrate their birthdays understand something the rest of us are still learning, that your value isn't tied to a date, that meaning isn't found in milestones, that you exist fully every single day, not just the one the calendar marks. And maybe, just maybe, their silence isn't absence, it's presence. A deep, grounded, unshakable presence that doesn't need a celebration to prove it's real, because they already know, they've always known, they matter, birthday or not.